Welcome to Reputation Room. I'm Andy Hallmark. Today we're talking about storytelling, not in the abstract, but in the very practical sense of whether the things we put into the world actually say anything. Because right now, everyone has more tools than ever. You can open ChatGPT or Claude and get a post, a headline, a draft, a campaign idea, a quote, whatever you need in a few seconds. And sometimes that's useful. I use these tools and I am not anti AI, but I do think we're entering a moment where a lot of communication feels technically acceptable and kind of emotionally dead. It checks the box and feeds the algorithm. It sounds like something a company would say, but it doesn't have much of a point of view. It doesn't make you feel anything and it doesn't really go anywhere. So today I wanted to talk with two people who think a lot about story, language, culture, and influence. Arthur Thuot is a strategist and storyteller with Storycorp, where he helps organizations find clearer, more human ways to communicate. And Dr. Timon Kaple is a communication strategist, writer, ethnographer, academic, and musician whose work sits right at the intersection of culture, language, and meaning. Arthur and Timon, welcome to the Reputation Room.
Good to be here, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here.
So, Arthur, I wanted to start with you because in our pre-conversation, you said something I really liked. Instead of just saying content feels shallow or superficial, I believe I said vacuous, we should look for the ingredients of how it got there. So let's start there today. So how do we end up with copy or stories that just lack substance in your mind?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that go into it. One is just incentives on an organizational level. I know you want to talk about that a bit later on, but when we're looking at sort of the ingredients of what triggers our vacuousness meter, or some people like to say BS meter, like bad storytelling meter,
Sure.
might be a kind of a backronym. But what causes that, we're sensing the shallowness, superficiality, vacuousness. I think it's a combination of things, but the most obvious and probably the easiest and most pedagogically useful, when I'm teaching these storytelling sessions, is to find abstractions. And abstractions in a storytelling context are things that we can't readily identify with our senses. So things that we can't see, touch, hear, taste, or smell. And I think abstractions aren't bad. They're not, they're not necessarily bad, and they often are required in stories. But when we're talking about more complex ideas, abstractions allow us to compress a lot of information into a single word or phrase, which is wonderful. But the problem is, as you mentioned a moment ago, when we're trying to tell stories that can move people emotionally, you have to be careful with abstractions. And often when we feel a story isn't working, abstractions are part of the problem. So to give for instance, I was doing some work recently with a national government department that deals with farms and food supply. So let's say that they want to tell a story about an orange, for instance. Okay, if they can call an orange, you have a pretty clear sense about what they're talking about. But there's a spectrum of abstraction to concreteness there, right? On one end, maybe the most abstract end, we could say agricultural product. And then we might say produce, or then fruit, or citrus fruit, orange, Valencia orange, and then maybe the Valencia orange that I just cut in half to juice for my wife, and the other half is sitting on the kitchen counter. That would be the most concrete image, probably too concrete for most corporate flavored stories. But I think it's the role of the storyteller to manage this spectrum of abstraction so that we feel the substance, as you put it, at the moments of the story when we need to feel it.
I've gotten into sumo oranges now. So now you have me just thinking about oranges. We talk about storytelling here. So obviously very effective. Timon, I would say, I know you've worked a lot with corporations. Do you find that there's sometimes when you look at something that's considered final as a story, content, whatever it might be, and you just say to yourself, that's been approved to death?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a thing. It feels like when you come across something like that, like my BS meter, Arthur, it feels tired. It just feels like they're trying to do something that's already been done. It feels very like template based. And sometimes that's all you need if you're just delivering a very kind of sterile message or announcement, and sometimes that's what it's called for. But yeah, when we're approaching something hoping to be strung along with some sort of concrete story or some sort of like expressiveness or something we can connect with, yeah, it's pretty easy to spot when it feels like something's been totally neutralized. Certainly.
So Arthur, you kind of spoke to this briefly, but okay, so if we're in companies and we say we want to be dynamic and we want to inspire the public and all the things that we say we want to do, then why do we create systems that do just the opposite of that and reward what I can only describe as writing mediocrity?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a risk and reward profile that people identify. And I think they probably see, maybe they don't have full clarity on the full risk and reward. Like there's always a risk in storytelling. And I think the risk is a very real one, that you might tell the wrong story, you might offend people, you might have to explain yourself, etc. The reward, of course, if you tell a great story, you're much more likely to connect with people, get them to care, get them on your side, make your place a much more exciting place to work and attract better talent, things like that. But I think people also don't see the risk and reward profile of never telling stories, or very rarely telling stories, right? If we are never putting ourselves out there in an interesting way, I think over time, our organizations risk becoming irrelevant. They risk being places where people aren't really excited to work about or work at and talk about and share the things that are going on there. So, yeah, I think it's maybe a expediency that's driven by certain institutional imperatives, especially when you get to large organizations, because
Yeah.
it's really hard to, the layers of approval. It's just really hard to manage that when you get to be so big.
I remember several times Tim and I have worked together on projects before, and we would be working for a corporation, and our goal was to put something. I'll use the word edgy. That's probably a bigger word than it needs to be. Something a little more edgy out there for this corporation. And we talk about how, like on the junior side, you first come into communications in some form or another, or anybody who has to communicate in some way and create content. And maybe you get beat down by the system a little earlier in your career. But I can tell you, there's been times, even though I've been doing this for 30 plus years, where I'm like, they're never going to accept that. It's just you feel like you're so constrained. Tim, and talk about that a little bit when you feel constrained, and how do you still try to find a story when you kind of feel the shackles already from the people who you're trying to tell the story for?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, in that particular instance, or one that we encountered when we were working together, I believe like the company that we were working for had received a very public jab from another company, and our initial instructions were to, hey, let's approach them with a stiff upper lip and say like, we're gonna swing back. And I think Andy and I knew that they weren't actually going to do that, but that was the instruction of the client, right? So I think what I ended up doing is writing two versions for them. One that was a direct, rebuttal, or like taking a swing at the folks that had
Right.
said what they said,
You challenge
but
them to a
also,
duel.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I was excited and ready to take that on, but the client was not, right?
Yeah, but are we just getting? Are we getting lawyered to death? You think, or is there no way to fight our way out of this?
I mean, I think it was personal preference, and I think to Arthur's point about risk, I think like the C-suite people that we were servicing were nervous about offending people. Although like a response was certainly warranted in that case. They went with the version that was very soft and actually kind of ignored the jab that they had received.
I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about a little different conversation that we had, Tim, and pre getting on today, which is I think you use this really useful analogy where you compared what's happening with not just AI, but the content that's put out today to what happened with recorded music. Can you walk us through this kind of an AI analogy you had there?
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that quite a bit, and we did talk about it, and I think it's what I'll talk about here is similar to what we're seeing with AI. It's not, a one-to-one thing, but, I think if we look at the start of recorded music, recording technology in studios were kind of thought about as like a documentation experience. Like we're trying to capture a performance or a voice as it lives in the room and how it unfolds in real time. And over time, as recording technology got more advanced and people started using studios as another instrument in themselves, you see really masterful works coming out like Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds and what have you. used, the tools and the tricks and the beauty of studio and recording technology to make this very different final product that was in fact almost impossible to recreate live. So to recap, you started with this idea of like the recording needs to sound like the real thing, and then it became like, oh well, the real thing is now pet sounds. The live performance should sound like that if it's going to be the real thing. So the pendulum kind of swung the other way. And when I think about that in terms of AI and writing, I wonder where we're at in that kind of sequence. Like, I wonder if we're in this early recording stage with AI writing where the goal is to make it sound as human as possible, but our BS meters are kind of going off. The alarms are going off
Right.
all the time. But like, are we in that spot, and are we approaching a point where we appreciate the type of writing that it can achieve, but at the same time we're relying on like the creativity part? Like, are we renegotiating what authenticity looks like in terms of culture and creative practices? So I don't consider that a one-to-one thing. It's kind of a false equivalent, but it helps us, I think about what could happen in terms of creativity and lived
Right.
experience, and what that means for the next step of this timeline we're on.
Well, I wonder though, not to just, crap on AI the entire time. There are times when I'm not gonna lie, I've had AI write something to get something started, and then what was kicked out, I'm like, okay, that was pretty good. I mean, Arthur, do you agree with that? I mean, are there times where it's not bad?
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes it's fine, and I think for people who are maybe more experienced and who are better at evaluating, you can see pretty quickly whether or not the thing is good. You have experience telling stories for decades. You're a good writer. You've been trained in that and worked professionally in that for a long time. I think that's fine. I think probably one of the things that I'm always a little bit wary of is making sure that we still have friction with the medium. So I know we were talking about this before as well, but like, what's the equivalent of a musician doing scales if you're a storyteller or if you're a writer, practicing sentences? A student famously once found William Gass, he wrote a bunch of novels. He wrote this great collection of short stories, In the Heart of the Country. They found him in his office at Washington University in St. Louis, just at a blackboard, and he was just writing stuff down. And I said, what are you doing? Are you prepping for a class? He said, I'm not prepping for a class. I'm just practicing sentences. I mean, this is a guy who had been writing for 50 or 60 years at this point. He's always in friction with the medium. And I think it's important to be facing that blank page. And I think maybe if you have the experience, as you do, Andy, of facing the blank page thousands of times, you can get away with outsourcing some of that stuff to AI, at least temporarily, because you have that evaluative capacity to know whether it's good or not.
That's a great point. I was talking to a colleague of mine earlier today, and we were talking about her kids growing up in this age and how, it's one thing, just you said it correctly in my mind. It's one thing if you've written for 20, 30 years, and you can tell what's good and what's not good. You can edit appropriately. But I would say that it doesn't matter if you've been doing it for 30 years or 2 years. You've got to share your story, Arthur, about the person that you were training who was a longtime professional, and then you gave him a blank page assignment.
Yeah. So in one of my classes, one of the assignments involves doing a piece of writing. The first part of it is doing it completely from scratch, and the second part is using AI assisted prompts to get something different out, and then comparing the difference and doing a reflection. And in a reflection, this participant in the workshop, who had been, she'd been, I think it was over 20 years, she had been a professional copywriter for corporations, and that was her present job. Her position was a copywriter at this big institution. And she said, I found this kind of hard to do. And I said, why? How could this be hard for you to do? You do this all the time. She said, for the last year, my workplace has been AI first. So all our first drafts have been AI generated. And I think that it was hard for her to do because she, although she had her reps in at one point, just like going to the gym. You can't just go to the gym for 20 years and then stop going to the gym and expect to be in shape a year later. Like you can get back to it, but it's something that, like any other muscle, you need to exercise.
Yeah, I always had the great fear that we're going to end up like Wall-E, the movie, if you've ever seen it, where we just float around and or drink our food through a straw. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a look. It's a little terrifyingly accurate about the future, I think, sometimes.
Well, Paul Graham had this great analogy saying, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, gyms weren't as popular as they are now because people had physical jobs. They were working the farm, they were using their manual labor. Now you can still be in great shape, but most people have to work at it because they have desk jobs. And he's wondering if similarly in the future, you'll still be able to be smart, but it will need to be a conscious effort on our part, not to outsource our minds to the wonders.
It's the wildest thing to think of. I do wonder though, do you think, just going back to this idea of storytelling that resonates with people, do you feel, either one of you, do you feel that the generations coming up can see through things that are non-human, or do you think they don't even know the difference?
There's been a handful of commencement speeches that have been posted, a few of which have addressed, AI and have talked about like what these new graduates' role might be in relation to or in support of AI. And the clips, like the highlights that have surfaced on Instagram, you have all of these, graduating seniors booing every time the commencement speaker brings up the advantages or potential progression of AI. So I think if I had to guess, I think people, a younger generation is probably starting to spot stuff they feel to be not real or inauthentic, or as, I think slop is the word that a lot of people use. So yeah, I think people. Certainly a graduating senior also has anxiety about what's next in terms of employment and adulthood, et cetera. So I think that was hard enough without worrying about, these stories about being replaced by AI. Being a young adult is hard enough. And I think there's enough fear around it that, I think they're very, I think they're entering into this pretty eyes wide open, and they're quite observant.
I think one of the tricks, though, is we can't be Luddites about this. There's no way to turn back the clock. I don't think there's any way to turn back the clock.
No, of course not.
We've got to learn how to work with AI to create great content. And I know, Arthur, and some of the stuff that you guys work on, you talk about that. So give us a little bit of kind of, how you feel about that.
How I feel about using AI to work on content?
Using it, more as a tool, less as does everything for me.
Yeah, I think thinking of it as a tool is probably a good place to start. In a similar way that a hammer, we can use it to build a house, or we can use it to smash our enemies' heads in. You can use AI, I think, in ways that are maybe less productive in the long term. So I think whenever I'm encouraging people to think about they're using AI, it's always start with the problem that you have and work backwards. Sometimes people spend a lot of time trying to do something that actually wouldn't take them a lot of time. Like they spend a lot of time using AI to do something that would not take them that much time to do. So there's like that's unfortunate. And then there's other things that AI just doesn't have access to unless it knows everything about you. It's getting better and better. But I think that really when we're hooking ourselves into concrete, vivid details in a story, often it comes from our lived experience, and AI doesn't, like, they can help us rephrase that, but the first draft, I think, is much more helpful to do on our own and then to come to AI afterward. AI is also really not good at some forms of storytelling. So the more literary and artistic forms of storytelling, I work with people who are trying to write novels, they're trying to write a creative nonfiction, and often the AI is very good at diagnosing problems that your story may have, but when you ask it to come up with a fix for those problems, like it'll give some great critiques, like high-level critiques, and then you say, please implement some of these critiques, and you just look at it and it's insane. Like they've just gone through and deleted half of the material whole cloth, and they've completely gutted whatever life was in the story. So, yeah. mentors in graduate school, Paget Powell at the MFA program, University of Florida. He had this 2/13 rule, which was you'd have 6 first-year people in the MFA program, 6 second-year people in the MFA program, and then a professor sitting around a table talking about a story. And he'd say, of those 13 people, 2 of the 13 opinions are going to be useful and 11 are going to be useless. You have to know which are the 2 and which are the 11. And I think often the AI's opinion is, it can be in the 11, it can be in the 2 as well. But then when you ask it for its opinion, you just stop there and then try to implement the fixes yourself.
Your professor had no idea that this was going to be something that you then applied to AI later in life.
I think he would not approve.
I don't think so either. That's what I'm saying. I think you're like, what are you doing?
Mr. Powell, I apologize in advance. Yeah.
Tim, the same question to you though.
Well, I think it's curious, Arthur, you said, in many cases you've seen that the best use of AI as a tool is sort of after you've developed the original framework or after you've kind of thought through this idea or have a first draft, which I really appreciate and support that. I think a lot of people, if you were to ask them, they do the opposite. There's ideation and then there's like, all right, based on that conversation, let's do a first draft and then I'll look at it.
Yeah. So I think in more, so I'm speaking like the more artistic or literary or creative, I think the later, like there's maybe a middle part where AI can sometimes help. If you're really trying to write like creative, imaginary works of literature, I think AI probably has very little to no place in that.
Sure.
But if you're trying to, I think there's like a middle spot where a lot of like corporate storytellers that I work with, it helps a lot in the middle place. But you can have a lot of great brainstorming, and I work with people in brainstorming with AI-aided brainstorm. But there's this wonderful concept, the last mile. This great essay by Hollis Robbins in this Substack that she has anecdotal value. And she talks about last mile. We think of it as being in distribution and logistics. So the last mile in the postal service is the carrier who actually brings a letter to your door. The last mile in intellectual products is maybe the human judgment that is increasingly a luxury good. Maybe AI can get us 90% of the way there, but the last 10% is something that increasingly is going to rely on that last finessing of human intelligence that has not quite been eroded away by AI.
I mean, I think that's something we have to sell to people these days as well. And by sell, I mean, I had a CEO one time just send me an offhand note and say, that AI is writing pretty good op-eds, isn't it? And I was like, I see what you're saying there. Yes, I'm sure it did a fine op-ed, but there is a certain homogenization of language that occurs in AI that I think doesn't occur when you offer individualism from a human. Wouldn't you guys agree?
Yeah, I'd say it's getting better and better. And like I'd say it was certainly much more obvious like a year or two ago.
Yeah, I agree.
The AI house style. I think if you know how to use the most advanced models, most people would be hard pressed to tell the difference if you finesse it. I think often the homogenization is of an approach and of like an idea, like the way that a topic will be approached. There's a certain homogeneity and maybe the philosophical approach to some of them that we get with AI, at least on a first pass. But I think you can still kind of tell. I don't know. Did you do that test in the New York Times, either of you?
No, I didn't see it.
Comparing like they had Cormac McCarthy and then they had the Cormac McCarthy AI version. You had to like tell the difference. They didn't tell you it was Cormac McCarthy, but they had like 5 excerpts from novels and from like essays. I think they had Joan Didion, Cormac McCarthy, a variety of people whose style is really great. And people had.
Did you get it right?
I got 4 out of 5.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
I didn't see that. I'm kind of speechless actually, because I was actually thinking about Cormac and Joan as we were talking about this. That's wild. I'm gonna have to go look at that.
well, I mean, I do think that there are times too. I mean, we did a lot of when AI first started coming out, we did a lot of work thinking about prompting properly, which is almost bear with this analogy. It's almost a form of storytelling in and of itself because if you prompt properly, if you feed the right level of information, if you guide story creation from the beginning, then even if you do go to AI for a first draft, your first draft is going to be much closer to a vision that you had out of your mind than if you didn't do all of that.
Yeah, yeah, 100% agree. One of the things that I show when I'm doing these workshops with people who haven't spent a ton of time with AI is two prompts. One is, here's some material that I would like to emulate, write me a draft. And then the other is going through 4 steps of content creation or storytelling: brainstorm, develop, iterate, quality control. And when you start from the very beginning, the likelihood that you're going to get something that's close to what you want it to be is just so much higher.
Percent. I want to wrap today by just kind of giving each of you this question, which is, regardless of where you are in your career, if you're somebody who creates content a lot, what is the 1 or 2 things that you would say you've got to stay sharp on, and you cannot outsource this piece of your craft to AI? I'll start with Timon this time, and then we'll come back to you, Arthur. I see everybody's like, I don't know, man.
Yeah. What to not outsource? I mean, first, I would like to say I did spend a lot of time talking about the negative parts of AI today. But part of the reason I'm here and part of the reason I consider myself an AI-enabled storyteller to a degree is because I do recognize how important it is. That being said, I think it depends on what one is writing. But I think one of the things about lived experience that people resonate with in storytelling is, and that is often neutralized, I think, by AI, is this notion of risk and risk taking. And, life is not perfect and safe, nor should my writing necessarily be.
Mm.
And I think AI doesn't understand, what it's like to walk out your front door and have everything change all of a sudden.
Mm.
Or to get a phone call from a friend and you see everything differently now. So I think there's parts of lived experience, and yeah, maybe it's the darker side of things, but maybe there's elements of joy in there too that we can still experience and articulate that AI won't necessarily get the full Technicolor 3-dimensional lived experience of it. And I think it's important to hold on to those things. Of course, it depends on the medium or the thing you're trying to actually make. But yeah, I would say the risk involved of going through day-to-day life that feeds good stories as we know them.
Thanks, Arthur.
So, Andy, the question is, what would I recommend against outsourcing for people who are creating content, especially younger
what are
people?
those things we should hold a little dear as content creators, basically?
The difficulty of actually facing a blank page. I think for people who are creating in a written medium, I think that's something that you should lean into. I think another thing, maybe this is a broader piece of advice that would encapsulate this, is try to find yourself in a position where you don't have to outsource that, where you're actually given a little bit of leeway to face a blank page and to create some stories and maybe to take some of those risks that Timon's talking about. I don't know if I can share my screen here, Andy, but I have an example of something that it's a classic example of someone who is in a big institution. So this is Canadian Armed Forces, and it's someone who brought the Canadian Armed Forces in the U.S. account. This is he was from the Washington Bureau. He brought it from 600 followers to over 70,000 followers in under 2 years. And then he went to do an English PhD at University of Waterloo. It's this guy named Kirk Sullivan. And what happened is that he spent a few years telling all these great stories. And the reason he was able to tell those great stories is because he was given high-level instructions and then was allowed to execute daily and without a lot of supervision. It was he was just given instructions and then allowed to follow them. So here's an example of one of his tweets. And this tweet is this standard kind of thing that he would share. Okay? This is Canadian Armed Forces in the US. Recruiters in British Columbia wouldn't accept him because of his Chinese heritage. By horse, he rode from Kamloops to Calgary in the dead of winter to enlist. He crossed the Rockies by horseback to fight for a country that saw him as less than equal. Remember, Wee Tan Louie. Just in a few sentences, we get a sense of who this person was, his courage, his sacrifice, his achievement on behalf of maybe a country that saw him as less than equal. And I think that usually in a storytelling context for the Canadian Armed Forces, we might be tempted to say, oh, let's praise all the people who have served so courageously and valiantly for their country and all the great things they've done. But we're not talking specifically about what those great things are. We're not naming the people. We're not being concrete. And here we've gone out on a limb, found one of those people, spent a few moments learning about them and telling a little bit about their story, including what David Ogilvy calls story appeal. So it's not, we don't have 1,000-word story. This isn't an epic, but we've managed to have some story appeal in miniature. And as you can see from the bottom where we say thousands of shares and retweets, comments, people like this kind of concrete, vivid storytelling, even if it's in miniature.
I have to imagine just some of the things he said in there. There had to be some officers somewhere along the line who were like, I don't know if we should be talking about taking risk. There's some risk in that.
Yeah,
in that tweet,
fought for a country that saw him as less than equal. I mean, that is something that, especially coming from a Government of Canada mouthpiece, is maybe not something that in a situation where you have multiple levels of approvals would necessarily make it up the chain. But I think that they trusted him enough to make those calls, and he did a great job and got a lot of traction. And I think he obviously was a net benefit to the organization. So that's one thing when talking about content creators. What do we want to outsource? Well, hopefully not whatever instinct allows us to produce things like that. And ideally, if we can be in a position where we're allowed to produce things like that, to take those risks, even if it's just in 140 characters.
I'll say too, from my perspective, that if you are in a corporation today, corporation I use, it could be government as well, and you find that they're starting to crush the spirit out of you just a little bit, I think we should never stop trying to tell stories that we want to tell. And if it gets revised, okay, fine, but within limits, we should find ways to still try to say to ourselves, we're going to start at least with this draft that has some heft to it,
Do you remember doing that earlier in your career, Andy? Did you ever have something that went up the line and
I remember wringing my hands at how they crushed my art. I remember all sorts of things that happened earlier in my career.
But how did you stay positive through that? Because I talked to a lot of people who are pretty junior, and it's immensely demoralizing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think from my perspective, I also really just loved it when I wrote something that I could tell had a voice to it. And I just loved it. I didn't care, all right, it may not make it into the Impressions magazine or whatever the internal thing I wrote for in that company was, but I knew that it was good. And for me, there just has to be this internal, content creators have to have this internal care for themselves that says, I'm still going to do the right thing, even if it has no chance of succeeding.
Yeah, that's a nice philosophy.
Timon, you've been through this. You agree with this, right? I mean, you've been through this also, I know, many times. Timon comes up with some of the most creative things I've ever seen. And we're always like, I don't know, Timon, you think that's going to work? So Timon, why do you still do it, Timon?
I think part of it, working for a communications firm, I think we're hired to assist, but also I think they're also hiring us because of the particular skill set we bring to the table. And I want to continue to show clients that we're going to think of things that maybe they wouldn't have considered and bring that to the table, even if it's not something they will use all the time. But, they came to us for a reason, and I want to show that we're going to push the envelope a little bit if they're ready to do so,
Right.
So
Did you use that edgy one, Timon? Do you remember what it was? The gloves. I challenge you to a duel
oh,
clapback.
so the on that in that particular case, they ended up ignoring it completely, and we went with a very safe version, which was fine. I think there was a therapeutic element in them requesting something that punched back, and that was all they needed, was to
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
internally it was satisfying, but what went out to the public was way different. There's also, I mean, to Andy's credit, there's also been like ad campaigns that I've written that Andy was like, we need to take a step back on that. I think there was a Woody Guthrie themed one that I wanted to put in the
Oh
subway.
man, he wanted to put that Woody Guthrie thing in there so badly. I was like, I don't think anybody knows what this means, Timon.
Yeah, it might have been a little out of touch, but I felt like for it being DC and Woody Guthrie being as political as he
Yeah, yeah,
was, I
yeah,
thought
yeah.
about it. But Andy was just like, let's pump the brakes a little bit, dude.
I mean, maybe I'm part of the problem. I don't know. I will say, I really appreciate the time you guys gave us today. I mean, I think storytelling is so critical. I hope that we don't just, leave it behind and don't try our best to continue to put great content out there, and that we use the tools appropriately. And I hope that someone's been able to glean from the conversations that you both have with me today, something that is useful for their careers as well. So thank you both, Tim and Arthur, for being here and joining me in the Reputation Room.
Cheers,
Of
guys.
course. Yeah, thank you.